Hi, my name is Kim Peretti. I'm a partner with the law firm of Alston and Bird and co-chair of our privacy, cyber, and data strategy practice. We're here today to discuss the panel entitled Defend Forward, Moving Toward Coordinated Active Cyber Response with three esteemed panelists, Randy Sabett, special counsel with the law firm of Cooley, as well as his associate, Andrew Epstein. And we also have Shane McGee, General Counsel and Chief Privacy Officer of the company Cofense. So thank you for joining today. I'm going to spend a couple minutes introducing the topic, and then we're going to do a round-robin panel discussing the topic in more detail with our panelists. So the Department of Defense described Defend Forward in its 2018 cyber strategy, stating that we will conduct cyberspace operations to collect intelligence and prepare military cyber capabilities to be used in the event of crisis or conflict. We will defend forward to disrupt or halt malicious cyber activity at its source, including activity that falls below the level of armed conflict. In light of recent cyber events, including supply chain attacks such as SolarWinds and Microsoft and Codacove, along with the ransomware attack on Colonial Pipeline, increased attention is being given to what the private sector can do and cannot do, and how to improve information sharing between the government and the private sector. To help provide some guidance, here is the cyber solarium definition of Defend Forward. Proactive observing, pursuing, and countering of adversary operations and imposing of costs in day-to-day competition to disrupt and defeat ongoing malicious adversary cyber campaigns, deter future campaigns, and reinforce favorable international norms of behavior using all instruments of national power. Now, there are some people who mistakenly view Defend Forward as purely offensive activity, but that isn't what it actually means. While active defense, active cyber response, and hackback can be a component of Defend Forward, they are not necessarily part of it. So, Defend Forward involves cyber activities that, a couple of things, are intended to affect resources outside of US networks, don't rise to the level of armed conflict, comprise appropriate actions that are proportional to the threat, and are intended to disrupt, deter, and defeat the threat. So with that as a brief introduction, Randy, could you please introduce yourself and talk to us in a little more detail about Defend Forward?
Thank you, Kimberly, and thanks everyone for joining our session. As Kimberly mentioned, Randy Sabett, I'm special counsel at Cooley, based in Washington, D.C. I'm part of our cyber data privacy practice and spend my time sort of split between a combination of different things, both on the proactive side, counseling clients on cyber and privacy issues, transactional issues around M&A, IPOs, things like that. And then the more reactive side of things with cyber attacks and breaches and those sorts of things. In a previous life, I was a crypto engineer for the DoD, and it's really interesting today to be talking about these topics and sort of where they originated compared to when I was doing this stuff many, many years ago as an engineer. So I guess to start out, when we talk about Defend Forward in the context of not just the government, which obviously has different authorities and can do different things related to these concepts. What we want to sort of focus on today is not just the government piece, but also the private sector piece and sort of the intersection of the two. We'll talk about information sharing in a little while, a couple of other things. But I think to start out, when you talk about Defend Forward in the context of the private sector, to me, it can be broken up broadly into two things. First of all, proactively imposing costs on the adversary, and as a result of that, degrading their cyber operations or their ability to take action against you, your network, the networks of others. And it's also effective public-private cooperation that allows gathering of information, sharing of information about threats, and effectively cooperating in a collective defense type of posture. It's comprised of a number of other discrete considerations that we'll be talking about in a few minutes, but I think at the end of the day, those two things are the things to keep in mind: proactively imposing costs and the public-private cooperation. On the issue of imposing costs, I like to go back to, believe it or not, a quote from 1964 from a RAND paper by a person named Paul Barron, who was one of the true inventors of the internet, some of the very early pieces of it. And in this report, he said the following, 1964, "We should fully anticipate the existence of spies within our ostensibly secure communications secrecy protection structure. Hence, our primary interest should be in raising the price of the espied information to a level which becomes excessive." So back in 64, there's the concept of, first of all, assume the attackers are inside your network. And second of all, your job is to impose costs on the attacker so that they actually decide not to attack you and go somewhere else. Now, back in the, I'll do the finger quotes, back in the old days, I used to use the bear analogy here, which was, I don't need to be faster than the bear, just faster than my buddy who's also being chased by the bear. In the context of Defend Forward and a public-private cooperative environment, that's not quite the analogy you want to use. It's really more of a me and my buddy and a bunch of our friends and different folks in the ecosystem all cooperating and sharing information on what that bear is doing so that the bear doesn't attack us. I think that's the analogy to take away. But I wanted to emphasize the fact that this is not something new, and neither, for that matter, is the notion of active defense and active cyber response, which we'll talk about in a couple minutes. So these are not new concepts. What they really are new formulations and new approaches to these concepts. And to sort of put that in context, if you think about the notion of cooperation and public-private partnerships, it's helpful to look at what types of policies and strategies the government has proposed over the years that talk about this. So going all the way back to 2003, the National Strategy to Secure Cyberspace, the strategy talked about, and it was an early attempt at articulating a national cyber strategy, and it was clear that information sharing was a core component of that. Then in 2008, we had the Commission on Cybersecurity for the 44th presidency. I was a part of that commission, and the commission was a little bit more critical at that time of public-private partnerships because, as the report said, the so-called public-private partnership is marked by serious shortcomings. And the real sort of problem was the notion that you wind up in a status quo. If it's not done right, if you don't have workable and effective public-private partnerships, it results in sort of a status quo where nobody's really doing anything, and neither the government nor the private sector needs are being met. That was 2008, followed in 2009 by the Cyberspace Policy Review, Melissa Hathaway's review. And the review team found that addressing network security issues requires a public-private partnership as well as international cooperation and norms. In 2015, we had Executive Order 13691 that focused on information sharing, cybersecurity information sharing, and it was focused on the private sector and the use of ISAOs, which are information sharing and analysis organizations. And for those of you who know ISACs, they're very similar to an ISAC, which is an information sharing and analysis center. But whereas the ISACs are focused on critical infrastructure, the ISAOs are more flexible and can be broader than just the critical infrastructure. So we've had ISAOs pop up across a number of different industries and a couple of different organizational manners that really become those effective things that allow information sharing, effective mechanisms. I worked on one with a group that was a real grassroots effort. They literally met at Black Hat in a very informal manner, a bunch of CISOs. And 2 years later, we had a formal meeting, we had membership, we had bylaws, and they have in place this organization that does a great job of sharing threat information. Even though the members are competitors, they know that defense of the whole is made better by all of them cooperating. And so it's that kind of the ISAL concept that I think we want to talk about in the context of Defend Forward. The Commission in 2016 said that joint collaboration between the public and private sectors is necessary before, during, and after a cyber event. So we start to see the focus not just on the reactive, but also on the proactive and the during, while there's an attack going on. Kimberly mentioned the DoD cyber strategy from 2018 and the notion of collecting intelligence and the Defend Forward concept. It went on to say that the government is going to strengthen the security and resilience of networks and systems that contribute to current and future military advantages. And here's the important part. We will collaborate with our interagency, industry, and international partners to advance our mutual interests. So you've got this concept, flowing through all of these different policies and getting refined and getting more focused. The Cyber Solarium Commission that also was mentioned by Kimberly, they looked at and focused on the need for imposing costs to change the adversary behavior, and the fact that Defend Forward is proactive. And it really was, it looked at the fact that the US has prevented cyber attacks has not created credible and sufficient costs against malicious adversary behavior in the context of trying to prevent cyber attacks of significant consequences. As a result, Defend Forward posits that the US has to shift from responding, being in a responsive, reactive mode, to being in a proactive mode. And then even as recent as the executive order on improving the nation's cybersecurity from 2021, the executive order said the private sector must adapt to the continuously changing threat environment and partner. Now we're talking about partnering with the federal government to foster a more secure cyberspace. So building on what Kimberly said at the beginning, Defend Forward is not, a single point or a narrow concept. Rather, it's a combination of different aspects of overall cyber policy, and it includes the notion of active cyber response and active defense, which we'll talk about in a couple of minutes, and also the fact that the dialogue needs to address liability protections beyond what we have in CISA, and Shane will be talking about that in a little bit. And ultimately, Defend Forward involves a balanced approach that has a number of interacting dynamics, which Andrew will discuss toward the end. So that's a little bit more on Defend Forward.
And Randy, can I just ask another, a little bit of more detail on this concept of imposing costs? Is that financial costs that the government imposes by proactively taking certain measures? Is it the imposing costs, making it harder for them to hack into systems because we're banding together, as you mentioned, the Barron analogy, and discussing together how challenging it is? But what exactly does imposing costs mean?
I would respond by saying all of the above and then some, in the sense that it's not financial from the private sector's perspective, at least financial in terms of money. It's financial in terms of creating situations where the attacker has to spend more, where more might be money. They might need to have better computers. They might need more computers. It might be spending time. So it takes greater time to get into your network because you have these defenses in place, or you've utilized mechanisms or have taken steps that are an impediment to the attacker getting into the network. And even going so far as to talk about active defense and active cyber response. Those are all things that are going to impose costs on the attacker that aren't just sort of financial in nature.
That's very helpful. I always sort of wondered how it breaks down in that way. So thank you for that. So before we get into some of the hackback and active defense, in public-private sector sharing, right? We've talked about this for years and years and years. What is holding the private sector back? And I would also be interested, maybe we'll cover it later, about the new executive order, which much of that is, relates to sharing more threat intel with the government, the IT service providers, as well as mandated reporting. So, what is holding the private sector back, and is that resulting in the government taking the position, well, maybe we need to, require more information sharing?
Well, I guess let's start out with the maybe perception is the best word, because I do think, having worked with a number of clients, having worked with law enforcement, both federal and non-federal, I think the sort of the historical response is that I'm a company, I've had something happen, or maybe I've not even had something happen, but I'm worried. And so I'll go to the government and I spill my guts. Here's my OCs, here's the concern that I have, here's what I think is happening in my network, et cetera, et cetera. And again, I think it's more of a perception than a reality, at least in my experience, but I do think there is some nugget of truth in it. Companies don't feel they get as much actionable information in a timely fashion from the government. Now, I think, and this is this could go off in a whole separate direction, but we won't go there. I think there are a number of dynamics that play into that. Does the government have an active investigation going on? Could there be, could that investigation be compromised if they shared certain information that might be helpful to the company? So there's a whole bunch of things that come into play, but I think at the end of the day, the perception is not necessarily the full reality. I've had a number of clients who have worked with law enforcement. I had two very distinct situations with clients where their network would have been owned much, much worse than it ended up being, were it not for the cooperation. And in one case, an agent from, I'll just say, a federal agency who spent an entire weekend on his own time tearing apart a hard drive and finding out sort of what was going to happen to that client next. And as a result, it didn't. So it's a one-time, one specific example, but I think there are others where the government does provide information. It is actionable. Hopefully it's timely. And I think really what we need to work toward is an ability for that dialogue to happen. And as I always tell my clients, you should have somebody from the FBI or some other federal agency on speed dial and a first name basis, so you can just call them and bounce things off of them, because they will do that for you.
I think beyond reporting to law enforcement is just DHS and CISA's attempts to get more and more information over time. And we have CISA, and we have a process for doing that. We don't have privilege issues with respect to it and otherwise. And now perhaps the new executive order with requiring notifications to CISA may elevate their role and be another way that they are able to get additional information that they're looking for. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
Agreed.
But let's talk about the favorite topic of everyone: hacking back, active defense, active cyber response. Where does this fit in the whole discussion?
Well, let me first start out and give a tip of the hat to Anand Shah, one of our co-authors of our paper, who couldn't be here today. He's done a bunch of work, as we all have, done a bunch of work in this area and talked about this topic for quite a long time. And I think if you look at, I said it kind of in my earlier remarks, we've talked about the concept of defend forward and some of the, imposing of costs and things like that. Active defense, at least for 20 years, at least in my experience, in an unclassified setting, we've been talking about the topic. The conversations don't change too much. I think there's been at least some subtle changes over the past few years. A group of us have been, writing and talking about various concepts within this and some of the boundaries of it, but it fits in a way of, as we talked about earlier with your earlier question, with respect to imposing costs and moving earlier in the attack process to confront the attacker. So you mentioned, Kimberly, the notion that this is potentially outside of your own network that some of these activities are occurring. And so that's imposing cost because the attacker hasn't even gotten to your network yet. And it's a set of techniques at the end of the day. If you think about it as a continuum, I used to talk about port scanning, and we had this whole diagram of a number of different things, and even port scanning is controversial, but all the way up to destroying the attacker's facilities physically. Well, certainly the private sector is not going to be doing that, but there are several things that people have proposed that could be used to actually, from a defend forward standpoint, put in place those additional costs on the attacker.
And are you talking mostly about the government doing this, or in this context right now, the private sector?
Well, that's, again, going back to the historical discussions, I think people, used to think of active defense as the wild, wild west, and I'm just going to, find the best attack tools that I can, or maybe come up with them myself and go after the cyber attackers. I think the more realistic view that's being taken these days is that it is a cooperative effort between government and private sector. Private sector is not doing things outside of their swim lane. We, collectively, we are saying that if, an action that is illegal under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act is not something that we would advocate. And we would in fact discourage. That's, again, going back to the authorities. The government has certain authorities that the private sector does not. And so however, from a defend forward perspective, there can be things. I think one very well used example is the notion of a honeypot. I've developed a honeypot. I've collected some interesting information. Should I take action on it? Probably not. If it's, truly is, for example, a nation state kind of attack or situation. But turning that over to the government, having that dialogue with the government that we talked about a minute ago, I think would be a good way of taking the information that I've developed and providing it to someone who could then take it further in this defend forward fashion. So again, I think it's that acquisition of actionable intelligence. I can do things that, collect information. I can work with the government in a public-private partnership or dialogue kind of way, and then have those real-time responses that perhaps do come from me. If it's nothing else, maybe it's some diversionary response or response from the government if it's something that is, if it's something that the actions that we've discovered, if they warrant action by the government, then the government can go forward. The example I like to talk about is, imagine if various companies who might be affected by some of these supply chain attacks very early on had the intelligence and provided it to the government, and the government could triangulate on, hey, there's something about to happen, and then share that with the community. That's the kind of thing we're talking about.
And again, active defense and active cyber defense are active cyber response are synonymous in this context with those two factors you're talking about, or is there a meaningful difference?
Ask a dozen people, you'll get 25 different answers. We've never, the royal we have never come up with a solid, when it's not for lack of trying, but I would say we've never come up with a solid definition, or maybe let's put it a different way, a unanimous or nearly unanimously accepted definition. I prefer, I'll have my colleagues, weigh in at some point during their discussion, but I prefer active cyber response, because you're actively doing something potentially from a defend forward perspective outside your network. It's a cyber action, and it's in response to something, not necessarily reactive, not necessarily an attack, but it's a response to something that you're seeing or you're concerned about or something you've detected. I think active defense is the next least objectionable, in the sense that it has the notion of active and defense of your network. I think one of the problems with it is it was one of the earliest phrases to be adopted, and so therefore got viewed in a negative way or a negative connotation. And then hackback, I absolutely don't like, because that's really only talking about the stuff that we're saying the private sector can't do. If it's going to be a violation of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, i.e. hacking, then it's not something that we condone or advocate. But I think the notion of hackback, people hear that term and they think of it covering this whole continuum that I've been talking about, when it's really only, I view it as only the things that are true hacking, which we're saying you shouldn't be doing anyway. So does that help?
You might have covered this, but how does private sector active cyber defense play into the Department of Defense's defend forward strategy?
Well, I think it's kind of what I talked about earlier, in terms of being able to provide information to the government, perhaps about things outside of your network, perhaps about, there was a company for a while, I don't think they do this anymore, but one of the vendors, it was one of the first vendors actually that I saw, that talked about active defense, but what they were really talking about was active defense inside of your own network, which sort of confused things even further. But I think it's that combination of activities that will allow this overall effort of defend forward, both a combination of both private sector and the government, to take action that will defend our overall network for the country. If you think about it from I shouldn't say a lot, some of the policies that we talked about a little while ago talk about, a whole of government approach and a whole of society approach. And it's really integrating those offensive and defensive measures where appropriate into and now we're getting sort of theoretical, but if you view it as taking these measures that the private sector has or can take legally, collect information from it, share it with the government, who can obviously observe other things that the private sector may not have access to, and also take action. It's that whole of government and whole of society approach that will allow will allow the government to leverage information collected from all those sources and essentially do the things we were talking about earlier: progressively disrupt, deny, degrade, or in the case of the government, potentially destroy the attacker or the attacker's cyber weapons and other resources within their computers and their networks.
Randy, one last question in this area before we move on to our other speakers. What are the key considerations involved in actually implementing active cyber response measures?
Well, I think there's, there have been a number of efforts and a lot of things written in terms of the considerations that will allow it to work. Anand Shah, the gentleman I mentioned earlier, participated in the Talon 1 effort, which produced a guidance that really went into a lot of detail about both the public sector and the authorities that the public sector has, and also some of the international law issues and a bunch of other things. They're now on their third set of activities, the Tallinn group, and so there's a lot of folks who have put together a bunch of different work. But I think if for this conversation and for purposes of thinking about what the private sector can do, one thing, maybe the first thing to think about is who should be able to use active cyber response techniques. There was a proposal, I actually don't remember who came up with it, but there was a proposal to essentially, based on testing and certification, deputize, for lack of a better word, private sector organizations that have the skills to do the things that would be needed by the government. I'm not saying that's a good or a bad thing, but I think it's something that it's a creative way of looking at the issue of who can use these techniques and when can they use them and how can they use them. I think at the end of the day, like we talked about earlier, anyone who is going to take action like this, on that spectrum that we talked about, really needs to think about, is this something that could be viewed as a Computer Fraud and Abuse Act violation or violation of some other law? And if so, move further down on that continuum. Is it any person or organization, or should we have a certification process, or should we have some mechanism? I think all of these are open questions. In a paper that a separate group of us wrote a few years ago, one of the things, in fact, I think it was in the title, was the notion of needing a dialogue on this particular issue, and getting all of these, getting a collective approach that, again, a majority of people would agree with. And so that would be one way of answering who should be able to use it. What actions are allowable? I've already talked about that spectrum. Certainly not all of them would be available to the private sector. Are there temporal limits or other sorts of guidelines that bound when the activities can take place? Is it only after you've collected, a certain amount of information? One of the things we talked about a little while back in a different paper was attribution. And, this assumes you've gotten past the attribution issue, because if you don't quite know who the person is or the entity is, how are you going to even carry something out? But at what level of certainty do you need to know? So are there those limits that bound when something can be done? Who's responsible if there's collateral damage? If you attack, or if an attack is carried out on a resource that looks like it's an attacker, but it's only because the attacker has taken it over and it actually causes a problem, then what? Who's responsible for that? Is there any kind of liability, which we'll talk about in a few minutes? Are there any kind of liability limits or safe harbors in a sense? And then when you look at this in the broader sense of the global norms being pursued by the US and other like-minded nations, I talked about the Tallinn Manual a little while ago, now in its third installment. You've got UN groups that are working on this in the context of information and telecom environments. And so, you've got all of that, but then you look at some of these espionage campaigns that you mentioned earlier, SolarWinds and others, and what does that do to calibrate what can be done here? Do we need to allow things to be more aggressive because we're sitting here in total defensive mode? A lot of people are pointing to that. So, I think at the end of the day, if these recent attacks that we've seen prove anything, we need agreement from not just an active cyber response perspective, but this whole notion of defend forward. How do we share information with the government? How do we do things in a way that create this, this better than the separate entities, when they're all together, they're a better group. How do we create that in the context of cyber and defend forward? So I think we need to look at that, and as is talked about in the Cyber Solarium report, and it's talked about elsewhere, essentially leaning into all of the strengths that we have: political, economic, social, cultural, and in that way, these kinds of attacks, they're going to still occur. Going back to the Paul Barron quote, the attackers are going to get inside our networks. But if we actually operationalize some of these concepts, we will be in a better place, and the attacks won't be as catastrophic.
That's great. And it's so topical, right? If you think about the Russian sanctions by the Biden administration, key aspect they identified was the international coordination and groups to discuss the attribution and other things. So there's so much of what you've touched upon in the whole of government approach we've seen just in the past couple of months, and announcements in various ways from the Biden administration. So very interesting. Let's shift over to Shane and talk about liability protections. And Shane, maybe you can start with a brief introduction of yourself. And then when we talk about defend forward, it would seem that there are a number of things that could be done to incentivize the private sector. Love to hear you talk about some of those things.
Sure. Okay. I'm Shane McGee. I'm General Counsel and Chief Privacy Officer for a company called Cofense. I started as an attorney in the large law firms, ending up at what is now Denton's, running the cybersecurity and privacy practice there with my friend and colleague, Randy Sabett, who you just heard from. Later went in-house to become General Counsel of Mandiant. Mandiant was acquired by FireEye, stayed at FireEye for a little while, and then ended up here at Cofense. Cofense is an email security company. We're known mostly for our phishing defense solutions. I wasn't an NSA crypto genius like Randy, but I am a hobbyist technologist, which certainly helps me in my work on these issues as they get very complex technologically. So the question to me is, what can be done to incentivize private sector to take a defend forward posture? And you kind of hinted at the solution there, what I think is the solution, which is providing liability protections. I've been both as a private, as an attorney in the law firms and in-house. I've seen kind of the fears, the trepidation, and rightfully so, that companies feel when it comes to how far forward they're going to lean on cyber defense. We'll get in a little while. I'll talk about the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act and some other things that Randy touched on. But certainly liability is and removing liability or giving some shield is the best thing that you can do to get the private sector a little more involved. But before we talk about the liability limitations themselves, because there's liability limitations throughout the law, those never come for free. There's always some price on the companies that are receiving that protection. They have to meet some standard, they have to do something, they have to keep from doing something to be eligible. And I think here, given the likelihood that if this ever comes about, that there would be a likelihood that there's going to be a similar requirement, I'll kind of start out talking about what I think the costs of a limitation of liability should be. I would start with something like requiring the use of trust mechanisms for vetting any products, services, threat intelligence used in active cyber response. Certainly, when you're talking about something this important, a company should not rely on any unproven technology or intelligence, and doing so can result in some dire consequences. To do that, though, these trust mechanisms require, going back to some of the themes that Randy was talking about, a strong public-private partnership. To vet that intelligence that you're using or the products with not just other companies in the private sector, but with your government partners that have the best access to information and technology. The threat information sharing in that public-private partnership also needs to be, reliable and timely. And I think there are historical problems, again, that Randy touched on with government information sharing. I won't get too far into that, but but yeah, just generally, I think trust mechanisms and that partnership is probably the first requirement a company would need to meet before it qualifies for any type of liability limitations. Another is, comply with some type of clear rules of the road for attribution. And, Randy also mentioned attribution and the difficulties of it. It's incredibly difficult, both from a technical perspective, but also from a political perspective. There are political ramifications if you have a state-sponsored actor attacking. So even if you do find out that it's China or Russia, saying that in a public forum has certain repercussions. So again, you lean on your public-private partnerships and try to coordinate the attribution as well. And that's more the political, and the technology side of attribution also very difficult. You can have serious collateral damage if you attribute an attack to the wrong party, and collateral damage from your response to that. None of this works. What I'm talking about works without this real-time information sharing and that public-private partnership that results in that. But you also need more than just the sharing with the government. You need some level of coordination. And when I say coordination, I'm talking about with law enforcement and sometimes the intelligence community. There are, if you think about a situation where you're going to have private companies kind of leaning forward a little bit in terms of their active cyber response, I think one of the main goals of coordinating with the government is going to be deconfliction. You want to avoid impacting ongoing government operations. And you also, if there's going to be a lot of other private sector entities involved, you want to avoid stepping on other people's toes if they're involved in some type of active defense or active cyber response. There's also just the coordination in the sense that there needs to be some type of standard or oversight on proportionality and escalation. If the government's is or a partnership between private sector and the government is there, then companies can coordinate their responses so that they are not, they don't lack proportionality, and they can all be somewhat similar in terms of defining a practice and in how people are responding. So in addition to the coordination aspect, we also need some type of ongoing assessment and certification. I'm going to talk about a little bit some of the current statutes that I believe we could build a template like this on. But whether this is a government body or an industry group, it's up for a whole lot of discussion. But the idea is that there needs to be some type of, if not oversight, then larger cooperation. And the idea, so I started with what you kind of need to do to get to the point where you deserve any type of liability limitation. If you do all these things, the idea at that point is that you should receive some type of liability protection. And there are, at that point you ask yourself, what are you defending against, or what are you trying to protect against in terms of those protections? There are two different types of liability that you would be looking at. You'd be looking at government action, and there are civil action and criminal action from the government. So there are two types just in that, but also third-party lawsuits. So that's the type of liability protection we're looking for. Randy mentioned kind of the big 800-pound gorilla in the room when it comes to liability, and that is the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. I'm not going to get too far into that. I think everybody really kind of understands what it is generally, but suffice it to say, it's very broadly interpreted. It covers a large percentage of conduct that people think about when we're talking about active cyber defense and kind of a defend forward concept. So if that is the first and the largest hurdle you need to get over before you engage in any of this type of behavior. So whatever happens, you have to make sure that the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act is amended, or there's some type of exception made for this type of conduct. But that doesn't mean that that's all you need to do. It doesn't necessarily protect organizations from third-party liability and lawsuits. to protect organizations from third-party liability, you need to do something else. And there, I think you probably look at something like the Safety Act. The Safety Act was the Support Anti-Terrorism by Fostering Effective Technologies Act that was passed after 9/11. It offers liability protections and liability management program for providers of anti-terrorism technologies. Now, this is something where you take your technology, you vet it with the government. You say, hey, this is what I want to qualify under the Safety Act. And then if you are able to get through that process and the government gives you a stamp of approval, then you get certain liability protections. And that comes in the form of a cap on litigation damages, or sometimes just a complete dismissal of any third-party lawsuit lodged against you. So you have both, going back to the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, you have to do something about that type of liability, the governmental liability, and then you might want to take some type of Safety Act, sort of use that template to create some sort of liability protection against third-party lawsuits.
And Shane, could I just ask you,
Yeah.
what is the the type of activity that we're talking about that we would be providing liability protection against? Is it broad ranging active cyber response, or is it a narrower component of that type of activity?
Can I recycle Randy's answer and just say all of the above? It's, I mean, I actually think that there is a range of different behaviors, and clearly we're going to need to define that before we start going into the liability protections and the exceptions and everything else. I want to echo what Randy said in that I do not believe that if you want to characterize it as active defense or hackback, is smart under virtually any circumstances for a private company. It is both dangerous in the sense that usually companies are fighting out of their league, I guess is the saying. They are they are in serious trouble if they are trying to put themselves up against a hacker that was able to get in their environment, if that hacker is state sponsored or otherwise sophisticated, because you don't want to be hacked back for the hackback. So that's one reason not to do it. The other reason is just the possibility for collateral damage is huge, and I've seen several times where clients back when I was in the firms have not gone after, but done some reconnaissance to see who was responsible for their hacks. It is led back to a particular process on a particular box somewhere. And then, they later find out that that's just a shell running out of a web server, a multi-tenant web server that's serving hundreds or thousands of sites. So if you had gone after that, you would have shut down hundreds or thousands of sites that were perfectly legitimate. You could get into infrastructure that could shut down utilities. You could do any number of things. And private companies are just generally not sophisticated enough to be able to go after a hacker in such a way that they could mitigate the collateral damage that's going to come out of that. So that's a long way of answering your question to say that there is this very broad range of behavior that we're talking about. But I would say that hopefully we're talking about just the type of things, the more passive, active cyber defense, things like the honeypots, maybe beacons, things like that, but not the active trying to hack back and take down your opponent, not that type of thing.
Okay, that's helpful.
Mm-hmm.
So turning it over to Andrew, based on what we've heard so far, it seems that developing a balanced approach to defend forward makes sense. Can you both introduce yourself and also elaborate on this in our remaining minutes?
Yes. Thank you, Kimberly. Andrew Epstein, associate at Cooley in our cyber data privacy practice group. My practice mainly involves advice and counseling clients, breach response, transactional support, both at mergers and acquisitions IPO level, and then also on a commercial level as well. In terms of the balanced approach, I think that, to Shane's point, one of the things that we're looking for here is establishing a framework in which organizations can operate. And so here we are talking about clearly following delineated rules, understanding what are the limitations on the actions that you can take, while also trying to assess how you could best go about defending your own network, and also, as Randy said, imposing costs on the perpetrators. And to do this, one of the solutions that we had proposed in our paper is creation of a public-private partnership along the lines of an ISAC or ISO that allows for sharing of information both between private organizations, public-private organizations, and then the public organizations themselves. And this would facilitate sharing of information in real time that allows for organizations to respond to threats seamlessly, while also not being inhibited by the perceived delay in any sort of information sharing regime. I think that there have been efforts to do so previously, but I think that with the knowledge that the organizations are better when they are working together as opposed to working in silos, I think that you're going to see an increased push toward information sharing between public and private. I think that is one of the main messages of the Biden administration's new executive order, is that these organizations really need to step forward and in a timely fashion share information so that our networks are not caught off guard or further perpetrated.
Great. Thank you for summarizing that balanced approach. And I think you're absolutely right when you look at the new executive order and the emphasis on public-private sector sharing again, but also increased reporting to multiple agencies. That certainly is indicative of the importance the government believes of receiving that information timely.
Kimberly, let me jump in on that last point that I think there's a nuance there, and I want to make sure everyone understands it. So for some number of years now, cyber incident reporting has been an issue, not here in the US. It's been predominantly in the EU. And it's the idea that if you have a cyber incident, and depending on the country and depending on some definitional issues, you may or may not have to, but at the end of the day, there are certain entities that have to report cyber incidents. Oftentimes, they're critical infrastructure, or they're telecom based, or they're in some other sector. But this type of reporting that we're talking about now is not the same as the laws that you have in the 50 states for data breaches. So data breaches, as everyone knows, are focused on personal information and some other, in certain states, different types of information about people. This notion that we're talking about now, cyber incident reporting, is focused on exactly that, reporting of cyber incidents from a cyber perspective as opposed to a personal information perspective, which is a pretty big policy change. But I do think, given all that we've talked about and given this notion of, a collective defense, it's that kind of information sharing amongst entities and with the government that is going to lead to some of the effects that we talked about. So I just wanted to clarify so everyone understands what we're talking about when we're talking about cyber incident mandatory cyber incident reporting.
Yeah, no, it's important. Of course, we have a little bit of that right in the insurance industry with the NAIC Met Model Law and DFS and for licensed entities. The material standard, though, for cybersecurity incidents, and we saw that right with the banking agencies, a proposal to include a requirement for reporting cyber incidents, but you're absolutely right. Very, very different than the data breaches that we mandate reporting here in the US in contrast to other countries that do have
Right.
the NIS directive and others. So very important distinction.
I think that this is an area that is ripe for additional support, both at an organizational level and at an individual entity level. I think that as private organizations are becoming increasing targets of cyber events, there is going to be a greater concern among them, and that the only way that they could kind of leverage their ability to respond is through collective action. And so I think you're going to see a greater sharing of information, hopefully.
Be optimist, right? So, and Shane, you want to give us your thoughts next?
We being the cybersecurity community, the legal community, the policy community, have for, it seems like forever, been trying to convince the government and different components of the government to share information with, to bolster the partnerships with private industry, because this can't be done without that happening. With virtually every executive order I see, every cybersecurity bill I see introduced, that is acknowledged. It's acknowledged. So executive branch, legislative branch, we've acknowledged it, that we need to have this partnership, that there needs to be more cooperation, and that the country will be better off if we do that. And it seems to never happen. It's been a very frustrating process for those of us that have been very involved with it. I think I'm glad that all sides definitely seem to see the benefits of it, of that cooperation, but I am not terribly optimistic that it's going to happen in the short term.
There is a question of whether we have metrics to help evaluate whether we are making progress towards better coordinating activities between the public and private sectors on active cyber response.
Great question. I am not aware of anything. I mean, we've got the six taxi approach. Andrew kind of alluded to the fact that there have been attempts at this. They haven't necessarily been successful. I don't know if we got much information out of those efforts, but I do think it's something that is needed. And it is something we had, some of us had done some work with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce on cyber incident reporting. And one of the issues was metrics and how do we measure what's good, what's bad, what's improving, what's helping, et cetera. So I'll use that to sort of segue into my response to the earlier question. I was going to say, either glass half full. I'm hopeful. It seems like there's enough momentum. I share Shane's concern, so I'm kind of between, on my screen, Andrew's over here and Shane's over here. I'm kind of in between them in terms of where I think this will go. I think there's enough people talking about it. I believe the message has gotten through to the government that we need more timely information, operating at network speed, essentially. But I'll also approach it with two words: colonial pipeline. I saw a really interesting piece just a couple of days ago about how it wasn't specifically talking about Defend Forward, but it was talking essentially about this whole of nation approach to cyber defense. And up until the colonial pipeline, the majority of people, unless you're in certain industries or focused on certain technologies, people just don't get it.
I want to thank all three of you. Great, lively discussion today.